Tonight, openly reviled by his own people, his army refusing to lift a finger to keep him in office. This evening, the Egyptian president said he'll stand down in September.
My first responsibility right now is to regain calm and stability in our home country, to ensure the peaceful transition of leadership.
7 days of protest have taken Mubarak from feared dictator to blustering old man. Yet he's not met the demonstrators' demand that he quit immediately. Tim Hewell watched as the protesters piled on the pressure.
I'm out on the streets of Cairo, on Liberation Square, on a day when a whole nation seems to have risen up and declared itself free.
Well, even if President Mubarak holds on for a few more months, and that's a big if, attention is now turning to transition and the security, political and economic challenges Egypt now faces.
As the ripples spread, I'll be speaking to Prince Hassan of Jordan and to Francis Fukuyama on whether this really is the Middle East 1989 moment. And what does the UK government think?
Yes, we can advertise and put forward our own values to these other countries, but let's not take that to the point of saying to each country, each state, you must have exactly this form of government.
Also tonight, their critics call them fascists. We meet the self-styled leader of the English Defence League. How does he rationalise their street war on Muslims?
When you take a 7th century book in its barbaric form, which they do, we have a problem, because this isn't the 7th century. It's year 2011, Britain.
Stephen Lennon is here to justify himself and the English Defence League. So, after a week of demonstrations, finally the Egyptian president announces he's going, but not until the next elections later this year. An hour and a half ago, Hosni Mubarak said he wasn't planning to stand for another term anyway, so there. Will it be enough to end the unrest in the most politically charged area in the world? In Jordan, a watchful king has sacked his government preemptively. First tonight, let's join Tim Hewell in Cairo.
Well, Egyptians gathered round their TV screens tonight to watch President Mubarak, but it wasn't in any sense an apologetic speech. He said that history would justify him. He said he intended to die in his own country, which presumably means he's got no thought of going into exile. But he did offer this concession. He said he wouldn't stand again later this year after 3 decades in power.
To ensure the peaceful transition of leadership and to ensure that the responsibility goes very peacefully to whoever the people of Egypt choose in the next election. I did not intend to stand again.
And that was the only major concrete concession to popular anger after the loudest calls yet for him to go. A people unbound, demanding with one voice an end to what they call tyranny. An estimated 250,000 gathered on Cairo's Liberation Square, telling President Mubarak to go now. The numbers dwarfed all previous protests. Every revolution has its own tipping point. Things could still be turned back here, but suddenly, for the first time on this square today, this feels like the tipping point of Egypt's revolution.
I feel proud, because now Egypt can say to the world, we also have a revolution. It is not the French Revolution, it is not the British Revolution, it is not the American Revolution, it is not the Russian Revolution, it is the Egyptian Revolution.
I was waiting, sir, so long years. About what? Long waiting for this moment.
I feel it's a matter of time, not only for Egypt, for all the Middle East regime must be finished.
From mid-morning, Egyptians streamed into the square, unafraid of tanks, now that the army's declared the people's demands legitimate, but afraid still of police provocations. Protesters held their ID cards up to prove to organisers that they weren't undercover cops. The activist who set up the checkpoints said some tried to bring in guns and knives.
Most people who tried to bring in weapons were police. They wanted to create panic, to scare protesters into going home.
Inside the cordon, there was an almost carnival atmosphere. This man brought his pet Moggy because, he says, cats hate dogs like Mubarak. The regime will be more worried by the appearance of clerics from Al-Azhar, Egypt's highest religious authority, which usually supports the government. But what I can't find anywhere in the crowd is an organised group from Egypt's largest opposition force, the Islamist Muslim Brotherhood. This rank-and-file member made clear that they were keeping a deliberately low profile.
You're being very careful, aren't you? Because you're afraid that if you're associated too closely with this, people outside, particularly in the West, will use that to try and discredit this movement.
The Brotherhood will not claim this movement as ours when it belongs to all the youth. This is a movement of the youth of which the Brotherhood is just part.
He's right. This crowd is a canvas of Egyptian society, and that fact is forcing outside powers to change their calculations.
Many governments have been happy to support Mubarak, to fund Mubarak, to ignore human rights and not to push for democracy because of this paranoia about a Muslim Brotherhood takeover. Yet what we see here and what we've seen over the past days is that Muslim Brotherhood has been part of coalitions involving leftist groups, involving political opposition parties, the National Association for Change, youth groups such as April 6. They have not tried to take advantage of the situation. Even the chanting that you hear on the square is not the Muslim Brotherhood chants that we know from other demonstrations.
The demand for transition in Egypt now seems almost universal, though it may be so complicated that a flowchart would help. These protesters can't agree what their placard should demand: President Mubarak's immediate departure or something a bit more gradual.
We should have a certain or a time that he can peacefully handle the authority to another government.
The biggest unknown factor in any transition will be the army. It's made clear that it doesn't want to shoot protesters. That's not quite the same as saying that the top brass wants Mubarak and his whole system overthrown.
The refusal of the army to get involved has left everyone here feeling a bit heady, but perhaps rather too heady. The Egyptian regime grew out of the army. They retain still very close links.
In the crowd, I met this retired general who supports the protesters and says he's not alone.
There are many generals who think like me, and they are real Egyptians. We fought 3 or 4 wars for our country. Comrades have died for it.
And it's not just retired servicemen who may be blending into the crowd.
I just met a serving officer, a young major in the Air Force, who told me there are very many others from the armed forces like him supporting the protesters in the crowds today. But he said that he could be jailed if he spoke to me openly. How much do we know about the army?
We know very little about the army as an institution. It's been one of the red lines in the media about which you can't publish even positive analysis, let alone any negative analysis. And I think that's one of the reasons why the crowds have greeted the army with such open arms. They know very little about it. But one of the concerns that a lot of opposition politicians here have at the moment is that there may be divisions within the army in terms of decision making, because that would lead to the kind of chaotic situation which could spiral out of control.
Right now, the Egyptian revolution looks remarkably well ordered, but the past week has shown the potential for violence on both sides. No one yet knows whether images like this are mere symbol or real threat.
Well, let's have a quick word now with Tim Hewell, who's still in Cairo, obviously. Tim, is this statement from the President going to be enough?
Well, I really don't think it is. I've been back out onto Tahrir Square this evening talking to some protesters, and the feeling very, very much is that this is much too little, too late. This is what some of them said.
13 years ago. It is enough. It is enough.
If we accept this, he would change a lot in the next few months. So I don't want him anymore.
We will stay here till he will leave. Leave. Just leave.
I think the thing is, of course, any revolution of this kind has its own momentum. And as people lose fear, as the authorities make some concessions, demands inevitably get ratcheted up. And therefore, if only a few days ago people were talking, for example, they wanted the resignation of the Interior Minister, they wanted the resignation of Mubarak, you go out onto the streets today, and for the very first time, people are talking about the prosecution of Mubarak, the prosecution of the former Interior Minister. So already we're into a very different game. There are already protests planned again for Friday. It's being called Departure Friday, and I'm pretty sure they're likely to be as big as the ones today were.
Tim, thank you very much. So, what might be in store for Egypt now? Here's our diplomatic editor, Mark Urban.
So if the Mubarak era is coming to an end, what next? The president says he wants to oversee the transition himself, but the opposition has become fixed upon the idea of driving him into exile as quickly as possible.
The demonstrators want this to end, if not today, then this Friday at the latest, which they call Departure Friday. But I hope that President Mubarak agrees to leave before then and leaves the country after 30 years in power.
So until the terms for transition can be agreed, the street confrontation is set to continue.
The speech also has lots of codes as well. That it's protection against chaos. It is providing peaceful transition of power. So if you don't accept that, then chaos might ensue. And I don't know what that code is for and to whom. And people will be totally frightened. And I'm not sure this will make the opposition do not want to leave the street.
Egypt's traditional power brokers started their own transition late last week. The appointment of Omar Suleiman, former intelligence boss, as vice president, was meant to secure the interests of the old guard. The salute was a bit of a giveaway. But he was instantly rejected by the demonstrators. The country's business leaders and generals may have to find another chosen candidate.
The big question is whether this is directed against Mubarak personally, or whether this is directed against the whole establishment, which includes the army, the security services, and includes Omar Suleiman himself and the new prime minister, and would be also could become anti-Western.
The Muslim Brotherhood have come out in favour of the Chief Justice of the Constitutional Court as a caretaker leader. Some others favour Mohammed ElBaradei or the Speaker of the Parliament. But whether one of them gets the job or General Suleiman, the old Guard's candidate, somehow manages to cling on to power, whoever runs Egypt over the next few months could be in for a nightmare.
It's a very rough road. There's no guarantee that Egypt will proceed in an orderly fashion toward real democracy. There are a lot of things that can go wrong along the way, and the economic vulnerabilities are something that often goes wrong in young democracies. So there are a lot of risks. On the other hand, I don't think there's any prospect of turning back the process of change.
The protests have already caused a hefty economic toll. Unemployment played a part in fueling it all. Yet Egypt's economic growth rate has been very respectable compared, say, to Britain's in recent years. But if that didn't satisfy Egyptians, what chance that a weak interim government can? And it'll all happen in the run-up to elections that US and European leaders insist must be free and fair. As Egypt moves towards elections currently scheduled for September, it'll face all manner of trials. The economy could tank, there could be many more mass protests. And then there's the result of the polls themselves. If the Muslim Brotherhood, by far the best organised opposition force in the country, triumphs, will the army respect it, or will they step in? In Alexandria, traditional stronghold of the Brotherhood, some protests have taken on an Islamic flavour.
but the movement has sought to soothe concerns about its influence, for example declaring today that it would respect international treaties, code for not reneging on peace with Israel. So far, most of the demonstrations have not taken on an Islamist character.
People just want to get rid of a model that they think has failed, does not answer their concerns, and is not sustainable. And they want freedom. They haven't expressed anti-Western feelings or anti-Israeli feelings or anything like that.
As the country moves towards elections and beyond, all eyes will remain on the army. There are grim precedents for its seizing power, both in Egypt itself in the 50s and in Algeria in 1991, when the generals moved to quash an Islamist victory at the polls.
There certainly have been discussions among political forces in Egypt before this uprising about perhaps that the Muslim Brotherhood would refrain from running for the presidency and would just run for the parliament, at least in the short term, thereby showing that they have no intention of trying to dominate the entire system.
For the moment, these questions are in limbo, since tonight's address showed President Mubarak wants to hold on a little longer. But even if he succeeds in that, Egypt is now focusing on transition.
Well, in a moment we'll be talking to Professor Francis Fukuyama, the American economist and author of The End of History, who joins us from Stanford. But first, let's talk to His Royal Highness Prince Hassan of Jordan, who's coming in from Amman. Now, Prince Hassan, how significant a moment is this?
It's a moment that is of tremendous interest to millions of young Arab youth, and I stress youth because you referred to the Muslim Brotherhood a moment ago, and the Muslim Brotherhood is aging even in Alexandria, and it is a movement of empowering youth that we are seeing. They want to be empowered politically, socially and economically. And I think that the president can't afford to ignore that. In fact, he was talking about his anxiety for tomorrow. What is difficult about it all is that we are living in a time of deep anxiety in the whole Arab world and fear of the unknown. We all yearn for a time when this kind of transition will be a normality. And of course, it took 20 years even for the Eastern European countries after the fall of Honecker. You said this might be a Honecker moment or a similarity with 1989, but it took 20 years for Czechia, the Hungarians and the Poles to develop membership of the European Union. We're still far from that point, and the questions are being raised. Why was the United States so deeply ambivalent about Tunis? Is it less ambivalent about Egypt? And Satloff, as one of the senior commentators in the state, Robert Satloff, has recently said a vacuum is acceptable so long as it is not filled by the Islamists, because American interests have to be protected. So we have this situation of the external threat to the peace treaty and the commitments to Israel, but we also have the more important existential threat for the peoples in the region, and this is why change is coming.
Right throughout the region. I mean, your king sacked the whole government today, didn't he?
Well, it was the end of the Rifai government, and a new prime minister, Dr. Bakhit, has been appointed. I'm cognizant of his interest in bringing together the people, civil society and government. He's made this very clear in a number of statements. I don't want to preempt his own statement because he's...
Well, let me ask you this then. I mean, do you think we are about to see proper democracy in the Arab countries of the Middle East?
Well, I don't know how you term proper democracy.
Well,
but,
it would be a democracy. A democracy would be a system whereby, for example, instead of the king appointing a prime minister, he was elected.
Well, I think that we have to recognize that the commitment to constitutional monarchy is there in our constitution. We just have to observe that constitution at a time when the judiciary, the legislature and the executive are functioning as they should be. A national democratic state, of course, can commit itself to peace and stability and thus become a friend of the United States and the West. I'm sure you'll hear from William Hague in a moment when he'll say we should not be interfering. But effectively, there is that interference which is tied to good relations with Israel. This has been the only agenda for many, many years. But the national democratic government is not going to become democratic unless its people want it to become democratic. And this is what the events of the last few days have proven, that Egypt is a trendsetter.
Princess Anne, thank you very much for joining us. Let's go now and talk to Francis Fukuyama, author of The End of History and The Last Man. How historic a moment do you think this is, Professor?
Oh, I think this is a hugely historical moment. You had a big upsurge in democracy in the late 80s and early 90s that hit virtually every region of the world, Eastern Europe, Latin America, Asia. The only part of the world that didn't join that party was the Arab Middle East. And people wondered whether there was something culturally wrong with that part of the world that made them not part of that party. And I think that what the events of the last month demonstrate is that there's absolutely nothing wrong with the Arab world, that they have the same aspirations to have their dignity respected by their governments that everyone else does. And I don't think there's any going back now. The real question is really, why didn't this happen earlier?
So what has happened now to make this change?
Well, it's a number of things. I think that modernization itself, it's very interesting. In Tunisia and in Egypt, many of the leading people that are pushing for change are not the poor, they're not the marginalized, they're not the religious. They are young, educated people. They're technology savvy. They know about Facebook and Twitter. And when you have a population like that that doesn't have the opportunity for political participation, where the economy is basically controlled and closed to them, where they don't have jobs and ways of getting ahead for their families, it leads to this big explosion of frustration. And the vegetable seller in Tunis that set himself on fire just happened to be the particular spark that, and now in our media rich age, a single image like that has a tremendous effect on people all over the region.
Sorry if this sounds glib, but it almost sounds as if you're talking about a sort of domino theory of democracy.
Well, it is a domino theory, but I think we have to be very cautious. If you look at the so-called color revolutions, the Orange Revolution in Ukraine or the Rose Revolution in Georgia, or the American attempts to build democracy in Afghanistan and Iraq, there's a very euphoric moment that comes at the moment of transition when the dictator finally falls and people suddenly realize that they can speak freely and gather and associate and make demands. But every one of those revolutions has led to deep disappointment because the democratic forces then could not get their act together to actually deliver a real democratic governance. And I think that that's the real challenge. The challenge, in a way, is getting rid of Mubarak, in a sense, is the easy part. Now you're going to have this vacuum where it's the army and the Muslim Brotherhood that are the best organized forces in Egypt. And in an open political competition, it's really, really hard to say what's going to happen in the future.
Professor, thank you very much for sparing the time to talk to us. Thank you.
Thanks.
Well, now, before President Mubarak addressed the people of Egypt, I caught up with the Foreign Secretary, William Hague, in his Commons office. I asked him what the British government wanted to happen now.
Well, we need an orderly transition here, and we need one to a broad-based government, and we need one with real and visible change.
That means he can't continue in office?
Well, let me explain the reason why most Western governments hold back from saying the president should go or whoever should be the president. We do that because things like that have got to be owned by the people of Egypt. You know, they are a sovereign nation.
But doesn't it exemplify exactly what's been wrong with our policy in the Middle East, that we have by and large rubber-stamped, frankly, tyrannical governments? We've not worried too much about whether they're representative, whether they include members of the opposition, for example, simply because it's politically congenial for what we consider to be our strategic interests in the area?
Well, I will accept a part of that argument, because I think in recent years we have come to recognise that our strategic interests not only lie in doing business as necessary with those governments, but also in trying to ensure that there is positive change in those countries.
Do we want the Middle East to be dominated by democracies?
I think we want the Middle East, I hope we would want all parts of the world to enjoy greater respect for freedom, democracy and human rights. It would be great if the world was not dominated by democracies, because I don't think domination and democracy should go together.
Well, Britain is dominated by democracy. I mean, do you want democratic governments throughout the Middle East?
Without laying down their precise form of government, because even within Europe we have different forms of democracy. Do we want the Middle East, countries in the Middle East, to move to more flexible, open, democratic political systems? Yes, we do. But let us respect the fact that countries move at different speeds and in different ways to democracy.
But isn't that precisely what's wrong with our policy in that part of the world, that we temporise? We do not say we believe in democracy and we wish to see it everywhere.
I've no hesitation in telling people all over the world, whether they've been China or Russia or the Middle East, that we believe in democracy. But we don't lay down their form of government. We are not the British Empire. Right? We have to set a good example of our own values, and yes, we can advertise and put forward our own values to these other countries. But let's not take that to the point of saying to each country, each day, you must have exactly this form of government. You must copy the Westminster system. But we don't take it that far, for obvious reasons.
We spent 30 years tolerating a man whose police go around pulling people's fingernails out.
Well, again, you're talking to a new government here that has made the case in Egypt before this for the ability to make democratic change in Egypt. But again, I say, do we have to do business with countries in the Middle East? Of course we do, because what's very important in our national interest is not only greater freedom and democracy that should produce greater stability in the Middle East, but we also have to work on the stability in the meantime. And Egypt and Jordan have been absolutely fundamental to creating a better chance of peace in the Middle East, in the peace treaties they have made with Israel. So it would have been a strange government of whatever party in Britain in recent years that didn't do constructive business with the President of Egypt.
Foreign Secretary, thank you.
Thank you.